There's a majority of Indigenous people that are starting to learn about our history, that are starting to learn about, in order for our community to thrive, we need to build our economy. And how do we do that? Whether we work locally, regionally, nationally, or internationally, we need to find ways and means to build our economy. So we need to start looking outside that box and teaching people that, this is who we are, this is what we want, this is how we're going to get it. And whether it be internationally, doing trade, looking for investors for some of our major projects here in BC and Canada.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ken Coates. I'm the director of the Indigenous Economic Development Program at Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Delighted to be with you today. I've got two absolutely wonderful guests talking about Indigenous engagement in international business, and we'll go back to that really quickly. But let me introduce our two guests first. Karen Ogen is the President and Chief Executive Officer of First Nations LNG. Wonderful, Karen. Great to have you with us as always. Karen has been working for promoting Indigenous involvement in the energy sector for quite some time and has emerged in the last number of years as one of the most forceful spokespeople for Indigenous economic engagement and effective policymaking. So Karen, wonderful to have you with us. We're also delighted to have with us today Matt Vickers. And Matt is coming to us from Seashell, British Columbia. Matt, wonderful to have you with us as well. Matt, who I just discovered now, has 2 honorary degrees, one from Canada West University, one from Vancouver Island University. Fantastic recognition for somebody who's actually for 40 years, and you're too young to have been working for 40 years, but for 40 years has played a pivotal role in promoting Indigenous business engagement in a variety of different sectors. And I've emphasized the 40 years for a simple reason that, and Matt will know this better than the young people like Karen, that if you go back 40 years ago, if an Indigenous community sort of took over control of a gas station, that was almost local or national news because it was such a rare thing. There were so few opportunities, no access to capital. So Matt has been at the front lines of this process for many years, working in the banking industry, working in the private sector, promoting big projects like a railway project, et cetera, et cetera. So delighted, Matt and Karen, to have you with us. Just great. So our purpose here today is to talk about something that people don't think about very much. And that's the idea of Indigenous involvement in international business. So you're both going on a trade mission, and I think I want to talk about that a little later on, not right away. But I'm really interested in this idea of Indigenous people being involved in international business. It seems to me that you've fought for years to actually try to get attention in Canada, and now you're off around the world. So Karen, I'll ask you to go first and then Matt to follow up. So Karen, please. Why are you involved?
Well, I think that it's really important that we work internationally. And I've learned a few things going to the different countries, Asia and Europe specifically, and then coming back to Canada and realizing we have an abundance of natural resources that we can be selling to other countries that would boost our economy and helping these other countries along the same time. So it's a win-win-win across the board. And I think it's really important to have Indigenous people involved in these trade missions because no matter whether it be industry or government, they must consult with Indigenous people. So why not be involved right from the get-go? That's what I say.
You said it well. Matt, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. And Karen, I totally agree. I think one of the key important issues, Ken, is, and I hate to hit on it big time, but systemic racism is still alive and well. And as we educate globally as to the advantages of doing business, joint ventures, MOUs with First Nations for our major resources, because as we all know, all of North America is the traditional territory of First Nations. So as the rest of the world realizes, understands, and sees these advantages, then I believe we're looking for like-minded partners to work together for the benefit of all, meaning indeed everyone, because as Indigenous people prosper, Canada prospers.
Yeah.
So that's wonderful. But Matt, I don't mean to create an argument. I'm certainly arguing with you. Canadians still are really uncomfortable with mentions of systemic racism. But let's be frank about it. We know it's there, and we know it shows up in casual decisions, employment processes, business dealings. I'm a white guy, right? So I get to see, and I got lots of engagement with Aboriginal folks in different kinds of places. But I also sit on some of those other conversations, and it's way too often when the First Nations are not in the room that you hear the comments and the sort of assumptions behind that. So, what specifically can Canadian business do to sort of get rid of that systemic racism? Because that's quite a barrier.
Indeed. Thanks, Ken. I think most importantly, there's a number of entities now that really go through the Indigenous awareness training. So what was it like for us prior to contact? How did we interact with one another? How did we trade? How did we barter? Right? And then what happened at contact? Obviously, the effects of the residential school on our people. So causing all kinds of alcoholism, drug dependency, because, right, the abuse issues are horrendous. So if we look at people understanding and realizing how and why this has happened in Canada, I believe there's a better understanding, because my grandfather had shared with me actually that there's no such thing as racism, just lack of education or lack of understanding, right? So hopefully
that helps. It's a very optimistic way of looking at it. You're letting white folks off the hook again. So that's very kind of you in one sense. But Karen, you've been involved at the highest level. When you're working for the First Nations LNG Alliance, you're talking to the government of Canada, you're talking to the province of British Columbia, and the province of Alberta. You're not talking about working with the roughnecks in the field, wonderful people that they are. You're talking about working with CEOs of some of the world's biggest companies. So what's been the reception to the First Nations LNG and to Indigenous organizations involved in the energy sector?
I really believe that a lot of industry and government, they have that willingness to work with Indigenous people. And to be honest, some industry are still learning yet. And I think that the tides have turned over the years. 600 court cases later, I think that it's almost like their hand is being forced to have to work with us, realizing that no major projects can go through without our consultation and accommodation. So I think that some are learning that. Some are having to sit down with us and have a conversation. Some are having to build a relationship with us, whereas they didn't have to before. Yeah. So I'm seeing that people are hungry to learn more about the Indigenous issues here in Canada. Some don't even know our history because it wasn't written in any history book. Back in the 90s, I had to go to post-secondary to learn about our history. So the average Canadian citizen doesn't really know our history, and some don't care to learn about it. So if here in Canada, we don't know about our own history, how do we expect other countries to know it?
Yeah.
So they are also learning, and they're hungry to learn about why it is this way. And we're here to sort of create a new path. And, just referring to one of Matt's comments, we had an economic system in place already by trade and bartering with our neighboring communities. And so I think that in itself tells us that we had a system in place that was working for us in building our own economies. We can still do that with other countries. And I think that's a really an important and critical piece. It's exciting because we get to learn to educate and make other countries aware of who we are as Indigenous people of Canada, and be able to say, you know what, we're here, we're open for business. We want to build our economy. So how can we work together to do that?
That's terrific. I'm gonna get to the international part in just a second, but I want to ask both of you the same question because what your comments are really, really helpful. I think a lot of people will learn a lot from what you're saying. So when you have international companies, and we're talking here about Indonesia and South Korea and Japan and China, talking about Germany and Norway and other places coming to you, they've only seen what they see in the news. So I know the last few years, what they've seen in the news are stories about residential school grapes that got a huge amount of attention sort of around the world. Critical story, but not the full story of what's going on. They get very surprised when they discover you've got multi-billion-dollar companies and really, really active sort of things. So the question to both of you, Matt, will go to you first and then to Karen. What specific things do you do? So you've got a major CEO coming from Petronas or somebody like that from Indonesia or from a South Korean firm that's coming over. What kinds of things do you do as business people to get those folks to take greater appreciation for the Indigenous reality?
Thanks, Ken. Actually, one of the key things that I've always done when engaging with other entities, whether abroad or even in Canada or the US, it is stressing the importance of going through my one-day Indigenous awareness training. So if a CEO level comes here to Vancouver, one of the first things I do, I shared earlier that, I have a 25-25 Kingfisher weekender right here. So let's go out fishing. And it gives us the opportunity to get out of the boardroom and gives them the actual feel of what it was like for us prior to contact. This is how we lived. Yeah, it wasn't on a Kingfisher, it was probably in a rowboat, right? And how did we fish? Well, we made our own hooks and we used cedar that we made our own line with, so they get that taste of truly who they're dealing with, Ken, because they've already obviously done their due diligence and research and looking at whether it's mining, forestry, right, the energy. Yeah. So that's a quick overview of how I look at the best way to deal with that.
That's so great. Anybody who says that fishing is the key to good relationship is my friend for life. So, Matt, I think you got it right on the nose. Now, Karen, what's your approach beyond fishing? I'm sure you do that too.
Well, I think that it's really important just to build on what Matt has been saying. It's really about building a solid working relationship. You can't get around that. And I think by sitting down, sharing a meal, because we are people first. We are not our job titles. We are not our companies. We are people first, and we need to relate to one another as people and just get to know one another. Because there's a lot of fears, there's a lot of misconceptions to this day on how people either know how to or don't know how to relate to Indigenous people. I've had experience while being the chief of my community. We were engaging with I'm not going to say the name of the company because they've come a long way. When they met with all of the Indigenous leaders and were taking us on a tour, all of their workers sat at one table. And I'm like, come and sit and talk to us. Get to know us. Don't just treat us like this is a tour and, we're aliens or what have you. Like this, and have coffee with us, have some discussions. Because I really believe that people don't know how to relate to Indigenous people. Yeah. And I think that it's this regular, everyday, sitting down, sharing a meal is really important. I always say this in all of the different panels that I do, it is about building a solid working relationship with Indigenous people.
Yeah. That's such a great point. I'm always a real fan of just simple protocol. First Nations, every First Nation has a different approach. And there's different ways you do ceremony and gift giving and things of that nature, the way the prayers are said, the way you sometimes have dancing and things like that. And when I've watched business leaders who they're kind of stuffy, they've got their suit on, got their black shoes, they don't want to get dirty, they got their briefcase, and you get them dancing, and you get them listening to the drums, and you get them to having a feast. And all of a sudden, they become people too. And it's the other side of the question, isn't it? I mean, these are people who are, they've got a human side to them. I had an experience one time with a fellow from Texas in the oil industry who came up actually, Karen, to northern British Columbia. I think he was visiting in the Haisla territory in the Kitimat region. And he came up and he was been prepared for all the bad things. And people had prepared him and said, oh, you're going to see this and you're going to see that and it's going to be this. But he got there, and Kitimat's kind of a neat place. The people are all employed. They're working very hard. They got lots of business going on. They own many, many companies. But what really got to him was the chief counselor, Crystal Smith, sort of had arranged for them to have some sort of social events. And for him, he just completely shed his face. He became a different person. And he told me that after that experience, he had deep friendships with the community. And the sad part was that he was surprised that he had that. How can you not be friends with First Nations? You have the greatest sense of humor in the world, and you're stubborn beyond belief, and you forgive more than you ever should. So I understand why that friendship comes out, but they're surprised at friendship. So let's jump over a bit and talk about the international side. So how is international business different than Canadian business, or is just exactly the same thing? And Matt, I'll let you answer that first.
Yeah, I think, again, because of the history of relations in Canada, as Karen has touched on, you've touched on too, Ken, I mean, look at what has happened with respect to our history. So you have that baggage, if you will, for the corporate industry in Canada. Abroad, they don't have that baggage because they haven't gone through that with us. So hence, that's the major difference, in my humble opinion, Ken.
Okay, that's interesting. Karen?
Just as we're talking, and a couple of things have come up, I think that some differences that I see is the cultural and language barriers that we see. And then, with some of the countries that we visit, we almost share similar stories of how Canada has treated us. I think that's huge. I think we can share those stories, and that gives us sort of some leverage to say we have some commonalities here that we share. And I understand what you've gone through. I understand how that must have affected you and your people. So I think there are some commonalities that I see that cause us to grow, to have a deeper relationship with some of these countries.
It's so interesting, and so in other words, they sort of intuitively understand some of the experience, maybe the racism. I've certainly my wife and I've done a lot of work in Japan, and then Canada's attitudes for Japanese have evolved a lot over time. But boy, they've sure been harsh in the past, and they often talk about that same sort of thing. They actually turn it into a strength because they sort of realize that the Canadian groups sort of aren't sure how they feel about Japanese, and they can make it sort of somewhat more successful. So let's talk a little bit about your trade mission. You're going to China. So whose idea was a trade mission? And then we'll come back to who's going with you and sort of what you expect to get out of it. So I'm not sure who wants to go first, but maybe Karen, you can go first on this question of the trade mission. Where did that idea come from?
So the Canada-China Business Council, this is their second year inviting me. I have been on trade missions. This is probably going to be my 5th trade mission to Beijing, but I'm excited to be a part of the Canada-China Business Council for a second year in a row as a co-chair to this Indigenous trade mission.
So Matt, Karen talked about how she's been involved and how you got involved in the China mission in particular. So tell us who's going with you on this trip.
Yeah. So a fellow from back east, Jason Raskovich, is coming with me. He's working with me with Northern Nations Cooperative, along with Karen. The other co-chairs, John Wei Shao, a corporate lawyer with Denton's, a longtime friend of Indigenous people you may be aware of, Ken. And then another fellow by the name of Chad Penny. He's the General Manager of the Development Corporation for Kitsilus First Nation. And this too is my second year.
so one of the questions I have about this is how the communities react. I'm going to put this in a different context. I have several friends who are mayors of communities. And one of the best things they can do as mayor is actually reach out internationally and talk to international business and try to cultivate business people to come and invest in their communities. It's a really important exercise, right? So what's the story in terms of the community's response to you folks being involved internationally? I mean, are they okay with you traveling, Karen? Do you get any pushback? People say, "Oh, you should be here working on local things." What's the reaction to you being overseas?
I think I can say from the first time I went, when I was the chief, I did community consultation, and I had all of the support from all of the members from our community, because uh, it's not every day that a First Nations leader gets asked to go on a trade mission. And you really need to get the blessing of the people to let them know exactly who's inviting you and why, so that they can understand why you're weighing out of the community. So that was the first lesson that I've learned, is to make sure that you consult with your community members about everything that you're doing and why and how it benefits them. I think that's the most important question, is how does me going abroad, whether it be China or to the UK, how does that benefit the community at the end of the day? So that's one huge piece. I think the other piece is I don't think it's really common. Well, it is. It's becoming more and more common for Indigenous leaders to be going abroad and to be asked to go on trade missions. And last year at the BC Natural Resources Forum, I reported out on my trade mission to Beijing last October. And there are a lot of people that have come up to me and said, "We didn't know all of these things. What you said was critical information." A lot of people do not know that China has the highest emissions in the world at 30.6%. Then we have India. Then we have the US, that are the three highest emitting countries in the world. And we here in Canada, we have an opportunity here. If you have Indigenous people on board, we have an opportunity here to sell our natural resources to China. And that in itself will help boost our economy here in Canada and in BC, and for the Indigenous people. I think it's a win-win-win across the board. And I can't emphasize that enough, because here in Canada, we have like a 1.5% emissions. And I say this in other panel presentations: emissions know no borders. We have to look at things from a global context and act locally. So this is what Canada could be doing, is helping to offset the coal that China is burning and bring down the global greenhouse gas emissions. That's how Canada can do its part. We should not be working in silos as countries and only be concerned about our own emissions. We should be concerned about the global greenhouse gas emissions.
That's such a neat way of looking at it. And you think of if you got an LNG project and you were able to eliminate 15 coal burning plants, those plants are probably producing as many emissions as all of British Columbia together in many ways, right? I'm not sure the exact numbers there. But Matt asked this question in a slightly different way. So you're from Sechelt, absolutely gorgeous community, one of the most beautiful places in the world, north of Vancouver along the coast. Just because there's a ferry involved, you don't get a huge amount of traffic. It's a gorgeous place. What's in it for Sechelt to have somebody from their community being involved on a Chinese trade mission?
Yeah, thanks, Ken. And not just Sechelt, but indeed all the First Nation communities in Canada. But Sechelt, yes, as you know, the First Nation in Canada to go under self-government back in the 80s. They're now moving forward with a number of major developments here planned for Sechelt, looking at either a Holiday Inn or Marriott style hotel right across from their administration building next to the hospital. They're looking at marina development, so on and on and on. And one of the key things that we all need to understand and know actually is that access to capital for Indigenous people has been very, very hard to receive. Hence why I did my time with Royal Bank to try and change that. But I think most importantly is understanding and knowing that the like-minded partners that we need and require to assist us in financing these major projects are globally, because we've tried locally, and for whatever reason, people haven't stepped up. So if we go out globally, and indeed I certainly agree with Karen, looking at our natural resources, if they can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions globally by us exporting it, why aren't we doing it? Why aren't we doing it?
There's a real sorrow in what you said, Matt, if you don't mind me saying, and appreciate both of your comments. And the sorrow is that after so many years, local capital is really hard to come by. That the major banks are really slow. They actually are really good at coming in after an Indigenous community has created a solid business. So you run it for 4 or 5 years, prove it is viable, and then the banks will come in and finance you then. But they don't finance you up front because of Indian Act restrictions and access to land and all that kind of stuff, which is such a tragedy as you sort of go along. And what I find so interesting is that you got Indigenous people going internationally to find the money you can't get locally, which is so fascinating. So I ask the question a slightly different way. If you go back for the last 10 years, we've lost a lot of investment in the oil and gas sector. Karen, you know this intimately, in the money that's not come into Canada, probably $50 or $60 billion in the last 3 years alone. And when you talk to the companies and the governments involved, I spend a fair amount of time in Norway. They say, well, why are you pulling your money out of Canada? And they say, oh, because Indigenous people don't support industry, don't support the oil and gas sector. They're going to oppose us and criticize us. And that runs completely contrary to what both of you have just said. So how do you change, Karen? How do you change that perception? I know this is a huge part of your job. How do you change that perception?
I think education and awareness goes a long way. I think that people need to understand that there might be a faction of people that don't support major projects, and it's across the board. And they don't realize that there is a faction of people that do support major projects within our territories. And I've thought about this, and I think that 20, 30 years ago, we didn't even have a seat at the table. We didn't have a say. We weren't consulted. We weren't accommodated. You think about back in the 1950s, they put in transmission lines, highways, railways, even pipelines have gone throughout our territories with not a dime coming back to our communities. We didn't have a say. And we're left on the sidelines to live in poverty. And so now I think that there's some anger about that. And I think from my perspective, a lot of our communities are at different levels of healing. And I think that's important to every community. The foundation should be healing from all of what's happened to our people. And some people, when they get a seat at the table, they come with anger saying, no, we don't want these projects. And when they don't look at the big picture of, if you're on council and you're tasked with looking after the people, then, what do? We can either just continue with the status quo and continue to look forward to Indigenous Service Canada to give us what money for people that are living within community. Or we can look outside the box and start to try to build our economy and start to think about, well, how can we build more houses? How can we get more clean drinking water to our communities? How can we help impact these social issues that we are plagued with every day? We have issues like the missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls. We have the opioid crisis. We have the homelessness issue. We have encampments just about in every city, and it's getting worse. So, we need to start thinking about how we want to build our economy. We look at ourselves as sovereign nations. Well, how can we be sovereign if we don't have an economy? So I think education and awareness is one of the key ways that we still continue to not only educate our people, but other countries as well.
It's so much hard work. You got to deal with it on both sides. You got your own community members who are resistant at times, sometimes very, very supportive, but you've got other countries who have misunderstandings and stereotypes. And a lot of times you go to Europe, they still sort of think you live in teepees and then chase around with deer with arrows, bows and arrows and stuff like that. Matt, how much work is it for Indigenous communities to actually break into the international business community? I mean, this is not something where you show up and they sign a deal. This usually takes years of work.
Yeah, indeed, Ken. And I need to go back a little bit with respect to, the comments that you made about people pulling their money out because First Nations are opposed to any kind of economic development. If we look at Chief Alan Adam, he has made a comment, right, that we're not opposed to economic development. We just want to have a major say in what's happening, economic development wise. So those words are crucially important. And I think indeed in educating those abroad is paramount for us as Indigenous leaders. So hence what we're doing in attending these trade missions, very, very important, because it gives us that opportunity to share as to what we're doing, how things are different. And yes, we have factions that are opposed to everything and anything because of what has happened in the past and how we have been treated in the past. So yes, the work is very difficult on both sides in our own communities for the faction that, as I say, it doesn't matter what you say or what you come up with. If it wasn't their idea, they're opposed to it, which is a shame. Because,
isn't that interesting?
Yeah, when you look at what can happen, right, with cooperation, with education, with understanding, with mutual respect, everyone benefits. And that's the key. How do we work together so we're working together for the benefit of all? That's the key.
And so it's so interesting that you're so optimistic about this, but also forceful at the same time. In other words, nothing's going to come easily. Nobody's giving you any gifts. China's not coming over to give you $1 billion and walking away from it. They have their own agendas and their own needs and interests. So right now, Canada's relationship with China is kind of complicated, to say it gently. I think if you're going to India, people would be even more nervous about you going there in the sense of, Canada's got a very troubled relationship with two of the largest economies in the world and two of them with the most densely settled populations sort of in the world. So when somebody comes to you and says, Karen, what are you doing in China? We should stay away from China. You're obviously, you told us already at the beginning that you've been there several times. I'm assuming you're looking at this as a long-term play, that you make initial contacts, you follow up and you follow up and you follow up, and you maintain friendships and develop collaborations. But how do you respond to somebody who says China's not a good choice?
I guess for me, everybody's saying for the last, 5 years or more, 10 years maybe, that climate change is a real issue, not only for Canada, but for the whole world. And it's a front burner topic. We have issues like the carbon tax that's been inflicted on us in BC and in Canada, which has driven up the cost of living for everybody. So it's a real affordability issue. And I think that for me, I look at the big picture. I see and I read issues that Canada and China have some issues. Those are geopolitical issues. What I see is if we're that concerned about the global greenhouse gas emissions, then everybody should be concerned. If we're wanting to save this earth, we need to think globally. And whether it be China, India, the US, the three top emitters, I think we need to be looking at it from that context. And, I'm sure that I'm hoping that those issues that Canada has with China, we can resolve them. Because I think the bigger picture items, there's a lot at stake here. As our earth seems to be eroding, here we are with geopolitical issues when we can be doing things to save the earth. It sounds like a huge, task, but I think it's doable. I mean, like if Indigenous people can overcome what's been done to us in our history, I think that anything's possible. We're still here. We were supposed to be wiped out, but we're still here. So I like to think optimistically that these issues that Canada has with China, we can overcome them and start to look at the bigger picture and what's needed here and how we can help this world.
I love that, Karen. I think it's fair to say that your people will be here thousands of years from now. It is not a temporary thing. It's not a sort of a short rebound. That the persistence of Indigenous people is one of the greatest stories in Canadian history, just in the same as the mistreatment of Indigenous people is one of the worst stories in Canadian history. These things are sort of parallel. So Matt, what's your experience in China? Is this your first trip over? Have you been there as often as Karen? Have you been with Karen on the other adventures?
This is my second trip with Karen on Canada-China Business Council, probably my 13th trip in total. I was involved with a fellow by the name of John Latta for Shanata, the ginseng export. Then we tried some blueberries. I was over on our rail project. The list goes on and on and on. But I think most importantly, I totally agree with Karen with respect to how do we heal the current geopolitical situation. Quite frankly, I believe the Indigenous people of Canada are the bridge for that healing, because we're looking at and for the independent Chinese conglomerate, not the state-owned enterprises, because of the geopolitical situation. And I think as the independents lead the way in joining us in joint ventures, it'll then soften the geopolitical situation. Another thing to consider here is what has just happened in the US, right? Trump has been elected and he's going to slam tariffs like crazy. Well, if China's economy gets drastically affected because of that, why aren't we opening the doors? That gives us a fantastic opportunity rather than, oh, my brother did this, so I better do that. Hey, we're a separate nation, folks. Come on.
So we can pick up on this one, and Karen, I'll ask you your comments on this. You raised before the 600 court cases, which you've won almost all. You've won almost all of them. I mean, the interesting piece here is not that you go to court; is that you win them all, and you're sort of building this great wall of rights and recognized rights and privileges and all that kind of stuff, sort of one after the other. It's been quite an astonishing sort of process. The concept of nationhood is understood internationally very different than it is in Canada. So Matt raised this idea that you're First Nation. Absolutely, you're a First Nation. Absolutely, you have autonomous rights and self-governing rights and a whole bunch of other things. How does that idea go down internationally, Karen? When you go to talk to people from Japan or talk to somebody from Indonesia or South Korea, how do they react to you talking about yourself and your community as a nation?
I think that it helps with the misconceptions that Indigenous people are opposed to major projects, that they're opposed to business and building an economy. I think that when they hear that I'm an Indigenous woman from, I'm Wet'suwet'en. So especially when they hear from us, they're surprised because, from their perspective, they think that Canada's closed for business because Indigenous people are opposed to all of these major projects. And so when I go there, like I tell them, no, there's a majority of Indigenous people that are starting to learn about our history, that are starting to learn about, in order for our community to thrive, we need to build our economy. And how do we do that? Whether we work locally, regionally, nationally, or internationally, we need to find ways and means to build our economy. So we need to start looking outside that box and teaching people that, this is who we are, this is what we want, this is how we're going to get it. And whether it be internationally, doing trade, looking for investors for some of our major projects here in BC and Canada.
Interesting. So, Matt, your thoughts on this one? You're the one that used we're nations. I mean, it's absolutely true. So how does that go down in your experience internationally?
Yeah, I think as they are educated as to what the advantages are of partnering with First Nations, the set aside contracts on and on and on, Ken, their eyes open. As I said earlier, education is the key. Understanding how and what the benefits are of partnering with us. All of a sudden, things change. In a boardroom, one of the board members of a big company, after hearing this, opens up his cell phone and says, "I want an MOU signed before these guys leave." So that's the kind of stuff that happens.
So are you basically saying, both of you, that it's not that hard to get attention from international businesses? You're one example of this. Is one story. You're talking about one chief executive officer says, "Let's get an MOU signed." Are the international business community very receptive to the First Nations approach?
I believe so. We've been contacted by Japan and Vietnam. Those are on our list to go to in 2025. I think, like I said, that whole misconception that Canada's not open for business because the Indigenous people are opposed to these major projects. Some are listening to what we're saying. We're continuously telling our own government, Canadian government, that this is not a time to be putting oil and gas caps on. This is not a time when, we continuously hear about 2 million people using food banks across Canada and just the state of our country. This is not a time to be putting up walls and closing the door and not building those relationships with those countries. I think this is a time where we need to start to lay down our arms and start to find ways and means to build those relationships with the different countries that need our natural resources. I can't emphasize that enough. We're in a position to do that. From our perspective, from a community member's perspective, and part of our values as Indigenous people is sharing our resources. If we have wealth, then we share. It's a collective effort that we do. And that same concept could be applied internationally. Somebody comes to you and asks for help, we're inclined to help them. That's the value proposition that I see, is that there's, a win-win here. It'll help us to build our economy and also help them with the resources that they need to help offset those greenhouse gas emissions.
That's really interesting. Matt, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think most importantly is that as we go out to indeed educate globally, as I've said, the eyes open, they understand how we can work together, what can be done in looking at indeed lessening the greenhouse gas emissions globally by partnering with a country that has the resources to assist them in doing that. We look at, the tariff situation, and as I say, Canada following the US or following whomever. I think most importantly, if we start imposing these tariffs on technology that is going to allow the middle class to improve their lifestyle, why are we doing that?
Yeah. That's a really good question. And so why are we proceeding the way we're doing? And to hear what I hear you basically saying is that First Nations engagement could make a major contribution toward Canadian prosperity, a major contribution to sort of addressing international needs for resources and build prosperity in a more environmentally sound way. I know Karen's LNG story very, very well. At the same time, bringing prosperity to Indigenous communities for the first time in generations. It doesn't seem, that's what Karen keeps saying, win, 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 and it really seems to be exactly that kind of a thing, which I find astonishing. So let me ask a slightly different question. You're going over as a delegation of Indigenous leaders. You've got people from different places and different parts of the country. One of the things that I've been watching the last little while, and Karen, I very remember meeting you, I think within a month or two of you being named as the president of the First Nations LNG Alliance, the coffee shop in Calgary, if I remember correctly, with Kim Baird quite some time ago. One of the things that's been most impressive has been the collaborative capitalism of First Nations, which I think is rooted in the fact that individually your First Nations are quite small. You don't have 150,000 people in one community. Seychelles population would be maybe 2,500. Does that sound about right, Matt? I'm just roughing guessing, but something in that magnitude, right? So the only way to really be effective is to actually join with other First Nations. A huge fan of the First Nations Major Project Coalition, which now has 150 partners across the country. It is looking at saying, how do you get all these different people to work collectively on these projects? When you look at Woodfibre LNG and you look at the Haisla and their LNG projects, one of the very first things they did was reach out to other First Nations in the area and say, why don't you join us? Why don't you buy into this? Why don't you be part of our workforce? Why don't you help out? So, Karen, tell us what's going on. You do not get Edmonton reaching out to Calgary and say, let's get together and do something. You don't get Toronto reaching out to Vancouver and say, hey, if we go collaboratively, we're going to do much better. But you're seeing a model of collaboration that is quite powerful in First Nations communities. Your comments, please.
Well, I think that because I'm from the North, I feel like the North kind of gets left out quite a bit, especially when it comes to the whole province. Like, take a look at our elections. I think that there's so much potential for the North to continue to collaborate together with other First Nations from the Northeast, North Central, and to the Northwest. Out of the province, there's 204 First Nations in BC. That's 1/3 of the 600 across Canada. 50 of those are up in the north. At least 25 of those First Nations are in the Northwest. So we have the majority are in the Northwest and coastal nations. And those nations all have an advantage. They have an advantage because they have the ports, and to balance out their economy and for the environment. I think they're at a position where you look at Cedar, you look at Haisla, they have a port. Nishka Silisms is next on the block here, and I think there's advantages for everybody in the North to sign on to these major projects. And I think, when we get resistance, that's when we need to come in with that whole slew of educating and making aware and talking to people about this, because if they don't know, they're going to oppose. I've had to come and learn about LNG. I just didn't wake up one day and know all there is to know about it. My background is in social work. And when you become the chief, you have to learn things quickly. And so, I was, as an elected chief counselor, you are tasked with looking after the people, whether it be under the Indian Act or whatever self-governing system you have in place. You must look after the people. And I took my job seriously. So that was why we needed to step outside the box and try to look at doing things differently. And if you received opposition, you keep going, because if you have a vision on what you want for your people, then you just keep working at that vision, no matter what the naysayers say. You keep moving forward, because at the end of the day, it's going to benefit the people. And that's why I stay the course. It's been over 10 years now since I've been doing this work. And in my heart, I still believe that what we're doing is going to help our people. I can safely say right now, the project agreements that I signed with Coastal GasLink, our communities are reaping the benefits now. We have more housing in our community. When we were at a place where we had a housing crisis, we didn't have clean drinking water, which a lot of people take for granted. Now we have clean drinking water. To me, those are two huge pluses for our community. So I'm saying stay the course. Let's keep going at this. Let's see if our voice can make a difference here.
Well, I've watched you long enough, and I've watched the efforts that you and your colleagues are making long enough to know that it makes a huge difference in the lives of individuals and the lives of whole communities. So there's no question in my mind. Matt, your thoughts about collaboration and the fact that First Nations are working together so much better than we actually give them credit for.
Yeah, indeed, it's a fantastic topic. When I put the Gitxsan-Wet'suwet'en Tribal Council together, it was actually called the Gitxsan-Wet'suwet'en Government Commission back in the mid-'80s. One of the key things I tried to do was get a construction cooperative going with all the communities. But I was a bit out of my time limit, if you will. I was way too early. In 2019, I agreed to be a board member and now the executive chairman, CEO of Northern Nations Cooperative, entity designed to bring all the Indigenous people in Canada together, for-profit cooperative, on major projects to go out and secure the major financing so that they own the major equity play in all major projects happening in Canada. So I strongly and firmly believe that if we don't work together for the benefit of all, we're not going to have any work at all.
So I want you both to describe a perfect outcome from your trip to China and your trade missions generally. This is a lot of work. We're talking about the two of you and all your rest of your colleagues spending weeks in preparation, finding out about the companies, setting up an itinerary, talking amongst yourselves. You got to have some objectives here. So, Karen, what do you hope to get out of this at the end of the day?
I'm looking to continue to network with some of the investors that are more than willing to come to Canada to invest in some of our energy projects. And it's still on the front burner from China's perspective. They still need and require our LNG. We've had countries come to us to say that in order for them to move towards their plan, step 2 in their energy plan, they need our LNG. So I'm going to continue to advocate for LNG, for Canada and China to build that relationship, because I think with this climate crisis, we have the answers. And I continue to go to China until Canada starts to listen and we start to build those bridges and mend those bridges where it's needed, and so that we can do our part in this world.
Excellent. Matt, your thoughts on that same question?
Yeah. So from the trip last year, I made all kinds of fantastic connections. I too will be going back to move those connections and discussions to the next level, to start signing off on the joint venture agreements and start getting cash in the bank, as the saying goes, to move it from the pre-fees, fees, bankable business plan to a project happening, breaking ground. So that's the key for my going on this mission.
So you two have been wonderful. I've talked to you both before. Your vision is amazing. Your commitment to your communities is astonishing. Your gentleness, inspiring. Karen, you and I have been talking many, many times over the years, and I'm raised in a different culture. And when I hear your stories, I get angry and get frustrated, and you refuse to. You get more determined. You dig in your heels even more, and you become more collaborative rather than less collaborative. So, and I wish you all the best on this mission. I wish you all the best on all subsequent trade missions. I think what you're doing is actually setting a new standard for Indigenous engagement internationally. I think I told you both before that one of the things that really stands out is that at present, in 2024, Indigenous business is more engaged internationally than the average Canadian business person is. Indigenous people do more business internationally, a lot in the United States, but not exclusively. And what you're talking about is you're now talking about mega deals. Before, these are relatively small deals, a lot of tourism and things of that nature. Now you're talking about nation building exercises at the local First Nation level, but also at the Canadian level. So, I hope you have a wonderful time, and I hope you both agree to come back on when you're back and tell me more about what happened. Because we want everybody to know what you're doing. We want to know the outcomes. We believe that sharing at Macdonald-Laurier Institute, that sharing the news of these activities is the way to get people interested and to break down those barriers and misunderstandings. So thank you both very, very much for being here today. This has been just a fabulous conversation. I wish you all the best, and I hope we'll talk to you when you get back.
Thank you, Ken. Appreciate you. Karen, great to see you again. Looking forward to spending time in China.
Miss Hai, thank you for your time.
Okay, so long. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Bye for now.